Welcome to the fifth session of the 2020 Virtual Election Series, organized by the Human Rights Center and the School of Law at the University of Dayton. This session is also co-sponsored by the University of Dayton Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence, recently named a Regional Programming Center for the Ohio Cyber Range Institute. The aim of this series is to both, one, raise awareness and increase knowledge about important issues germane to the upcoming 2020 elections, and two, to promote widespread participation in the democratic process by the Dayton community. Today's session focuses on technology and voting. The issues to be covered in this session are multifaceted and complex. They include use of technological tools such as touchscreen ballots, optical scanners, and even online voting to improve the voting process. Potential vulnerability to errors, malfunction, and hacking of technological tools. Overview of technologies such as blockchain and enhanced cryptography, which have the promise to improve security and accessibility to voting. Issues of technology and media related to mis- and disinformation around the elections and what voters might do to address this. As a side note on this point, I highly recommend watching The Social Dilemma, currently showing on Netflix. Finally, technology and election security. With that as prologue, I'm pleased to introduce to you the moderator for today's session, Kenan Freechild, co-director of the Democracy is for People campaign. Among other important initiatives, she leads public citizens advocacy work on election security and holding voting system vendors accountable for ensuring machines are safe from hackers. She co-founded the Secure Our Vote Coalition, which works on the state and local level to encourage election officials to secure the vote and allow for recovery should a computer error or hack occur. We're honored to have her with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Kenan Freechild to the session.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be with you. It is an honor to be in this space in such an important series and such an important election in our history. And also to be moderating a panel of three of the preeminent voices in election cybersecurity and election processes. I think you're going to all learn a lot. We are going to have our three speakers speak in a row, and then we'll be taking questions at the end. But while they're speaking, please ask your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. So if you float your mouse near the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A tool. You can put your questions there. We'll be looking at those and be asking them after the three speakers have finished. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Professor Charles Stewart III is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT and a member of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, a leading research effort that applies scientific analysis to questions about election technology, election administration, and election reform. There's so much more to say about him, but we're just pleased to have him. Professor Stewart, tell you.
Great, thanks so much, Kenan, and thanks so much for the folks in Dayton for being here and for supporting this important series. I'm going to share my screen so I get to be the first to try out the technology of the day, and assuming this all goes according to plan. So I'm actually, my talk actually in some ways could be both the first and the last talk, because I want to say some words, first of all, in general about the structure of technology in elections. And then in my remarks, by talking about a technology that's oftentimes underappreciated, but I think is really, really critical, and that has to do with election night reporting, and that both the technology narrowly defined, but then also the human systems that are related to the reporting of results to the public. And so the plan is, as I said, to say a few words about the general structure of technology, to talk about election night reporting, and then some of the vulnerabilities that we need to be thinking about in this space. As I do so, I'm going to be characterizing election systems, both what happens in polling places and election night reporting. I want to keep in mind something I'm now calling Quisenberry's law, named after Whitney Quisenberry, an important design scientist who works a lot in elections, who I said in a meeting a month ago, and I've been repeating this frequently ever since, that every general statement about how states run elections is false somewhere. And so keep that in mind. I'll try to generally talk about what's going on in the states, but there will be some place where where what I say will be false in some details. But generally, I hope what I'm saying is correct. So when we think about the organization of voting technology, I think most people think about what happens when they in the polling places when they encounter check-in and casting ballots. So here's a typical polling place in Iowa, where we see two types of technologies. We first of all see the poll books where people are checking in, and this appears to be a place where they actually use electronic poll books. And then hand-marked paper ballots that are later scanned and tabulated. If we were to generalize this and abstract it a bit, we could say that we have a poll book and we have a voting system in a polling place. Now, what most people don't recognize or realize is that these systems actually that we see in polling places are connected to larger computer systems. In particular, for instance, poll books themselves, which record who's registered and eligible to vote in a particular polling place, particular precinct, is synced up with the voter registration system that's maintained usually by a county or other local government. That poll book, which can be literally a piece of paper, a book, or a computer, communicates with the voter registration system either through computer linkage or sometimes not through a computer linkage. For instance, when the poll book is printed out on paper. That voter registration system in a county, let's say, is connected somehow to an online voter registration system that links all of the local jurisdictions in a state together, oftentimes through the internet, sometimes, as in Ohio, through a dedicated network that's not literally the internet. But there are other ways in which the county voter registration system hits other systems. For instance, the Postal Service brings in voter registration information that gets entered into a local voter registration system. A State Department motor vehicles might have connections to the county and statewide voter registration system. And increasingly, states are sharing data online, sharing their voter registration system information, Department of Motor Vehicle information for the purposes of cleaning the voter rolls. Okay, so that's just on the poll book side. And then, of course, in order just to make sure you know who belongs in what precinct, we need to sync up the voter registration system, say, to GIS systems that layer voters into precincts. And so, but at the back end, after election day, there's the election night reporting system. In which all the results in the precincts are tabulated and then aggregated into a computer system locally and then shared statewide. So let's think about that statewide system. Let's think about the election night reporting system, where we have in a polling place a tabulator, see, a scanner. At the end of the day, the results from that tabulator are printed out, might actually be written to some sort of quasi permanent medium. The paper is traditionally posted on the door of the polling place, and the results are sent to the local election authority. Again, let's say to the county election office. Can be by mail, can be by internet, can be by courier. There's a lot of ways in which you can get the results to the local election authority on election night. So election returns come in from a variety of polling places on election night, literally on the night of the election. All of those results are accumulated together. They're brought together in a centralized computer system in the county, where that information then is communicated out. Again, it can be online. It could be by calling up the local office and them telling you what's going on. They can write things on chalkboards, but that information is disseminated out by the county. The county also then shares that information with the state in a state election night reporting system. Can be by telephone, can also be by the internet. As well, all that information that happened, the returns from the precincts, from the county, and from the state are reported out, and I'll talk to the general public, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Later on, after election night, all the election returns then are basically audited and overseen and certified by the county. Those certified results are then sent to the state, where there's some sort of state certification. This can either be done through either by computer networks, or again, through non-computerized networks, such as couriers, telephones, and other things, okay? So now, I mentioned the system because there's a technology of the system, but there's an important information flow through the system. And this system, the information flowing through this election night technology, is really quite dynamic. We as voters see what's happening on election night and the days following because of the operation of two groups. The National Election Pool, which has actually been split off into Edison Research and AP, which in 2020 will be sharing election results with the nations, with the nation. This is how we find out what the results are, and in many cases, this is how the networks and the AP decide to quote unquote call the races. And so, we get information through the media about what's happening through this technology of election night reporting. The information flowing from election night reporting doesn't come out instantly. It comes out over time on election night and the days that are following. I'm showing you graphs, 15-minute time stamps of the percentage of the vote that was reported in Florida on election night 2014. This shows it for 2016. You see on the left the relative amount of information that's being reported. On the right, you're seeing the what it looked like the election results were at 15-minute increments. At the beginning, gyrating between a lead for Clinton and then for Trump, and eventually equilibrating into the final result. These results are dynamic, and they're dynamic in particular ways. One of the ways in which they're dynamic is that in the days that follow election day, there's a tendency for the numbers to undergo what's known as a blue shift. That is, earlier votes tend to be more Republican for reasons we can talk about later. Later counted votes tend to be more Democratic. This has shown up also in commentary recently through a phenomenon that's called the red mirage, where people are imagining in the 2020 election, we're going to see what looks like a landslide for Donald Trump as election day votes are counted. And then later that landslide receding in the past as mail votes are counted, dominated by Democrats, and potentially a Democratic win in the long run, although it looks like a Republican landslide right at the beginning. There's some problems with this argument. I just encourage you to Google. I had an op-ed 2 weekends ago in the Wall Street Journal. So just Google my name in the Wall Street Journal. Some problems with that argument. Nonetheless, there are concerns. So in the 1 minute that I have left, I just want to talk about the vulnerabilities here to cue up the discussion. And the vulnerabilities in the election night reporting are of two sorts. There's one set that I call static vulnerabilities. These are traditional vulnerabilities of hacking systems, of systems being overtaken by malicious actors, or basically being run into the ground by mistakes. Those are things we've traditionally thought about, but I think this election is uncovering and highlighting what I call dynamic vulnerabilities. And those are the vulnerabilities that arise because the information that comes out of the system evolves over time and can appear to be manipulated as election returns are non-randomly reported during the night. What patterns that might look understandable to experts over the course of a night and in the weeks and the days following an election can look like manipulation. And it's that appearance of manipulation that can appear to be fraudulent and can be the seed for people who want to truck and mis and disinformation. So what is to be done? Well, we can talk about that. There's a lot to be done to try to deal with problems that emerge from election night reporting. There's a lot of discussion right now and educating the public about the nature of election night returns. Nonetheless, the vulnerabilities both for information warfare and for outright attacks in election night reporting. It's an important part of election technology that's gone underappreciated until very recently. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor Stewart. I would say we are a little bit ahead of time if you wanted to make that point. I have a little bit more time in the Q&A to explain your last piece.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Wallach as a professor in the systems group at Rice University's Department of Computer Science, where he manages Rice's Computer Security Lab. Without further ado, Professor Wallach.
Make sure I get this right. Hang on, things are, with technology is failing badly. Give me just a second. Shit.
I think while we wait, this is a good moment for me to remind folks to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. If you float your mouse at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can pose your questions for any of the speakers there. Do we move on to Liz and come back, Dan?
All right, I'm sorry. Does everybody see my video now?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yep.
All right, the tech is working. I apologize for that. All right, so I'm going to tell a very quick story that starts August 29, 2016. This is a mere 2 months prior to the election. And the big part of the story was that we learned, this is the story that broke, that Russian hackers had targeted Arizona's election systems. And we later learned that there were a number of other states involved. But this was the beginning of a large set of questions. What were they up to? What might they accomplish? What can we do to mitigate? Here I am a mere couple weeks later testifying in Washington about the very question. And I want to present a taxonomy of issues today, of things that could go wrong in an election and what we might do about some of them if they occur. So first, let's talk about voter registration. So voter registration could fail accidentally. In this case, there's a story from earlier this week in Florida where the story is that too many voters or too many prospective voters were visiting a state website to try to either verify or update their voter registration status, and the website broke. So this can happen purely by accident, or it can happen purposefully and maliciously. From an attacker's perspective, this class of attack is very easy to do and very hard to defend against. If you'd spoken to me 4 years ago, this was the very top of my worries. And of course, there's a related issue with voter registration of how we purge voters from the rolls that I'm not going to be talking about today, but it's closely related to this. What I do want to talk about more are electronic poll books. This is one of many products in the space. Whenever you have early voting, where any voter can go to any early voting location in their county, then there needs to be some kind of electronic mechanism to make sure that a voter can only vote once. And that means some kind of online system that collects voter registration checkoff data from each location and centralizes it and makes sure that we distribute that back out again so a voter can only vote once. These are necessarily online for some definition of online, and therefore are potentially quite vulnerable to attackers. It's also important to point out that there are no federal standards of any kind regulating how electronic poll books work. Every state provides some different amount of scrutiny, as we heard from Charles Stewart about Quisenberry's law, that I can't tell you in general how good these things are regulated, except to say that there are no accepted standards And there have been no serious security analyses by third parties that are available for all of us to read. And that means that the hacks of the poll books are themselves a significant vulnerability. What could they potentially do? They could potentially allow voters to vote more than once, or they could potentially legitimately block legitimate voters from being able to vote at all. A vulnerability that we've known about since the early 2000s are when we have paperless electronic voting machines. Every single one of them has well-known vulnerabilities. This is a picture of the Hart Intercivic eSlate, which is the one I happen to be voting on here in Houston. But they all have this problem. They were all studied extensively over a decade ago, and every single commercial voting system of this type has significant vulnerabilities. Of particular note for this one, these vulnerabilities were found in 2007, and there have been no security patches from the vendor. So 13 years of service with known vulnerabilities. Still in use in Houston. I get to vote starting next week, apparently for the last time. So these vulnerabilities, if I had more time, I would go through them in great detail. But suffice to say that once you compromise one machine, then through regular voters and poll workers doing their normal processes, that vulnerability can spread across the whole fleet of voting systems. What could malware do in a voting system? Malware could flip votes, change votes, delete votes, and there would be no recourse. There would be no way to recover the original intent of those voters. Verified Voting is a not-for-profit organization that tries to keep track of what kinds of voting machines are being used where. This is their latest US map. And what you can see is that some states like Louisiana and Utah vote monolithically, where every county in the state uses the same technology, whereas Texas, you can see, is a checkerboard of different technologies, where some places are using these DRE, electronic voting machines, without any sort of paper. That's the dark red on this map. And Harris County, Houston, that's in Southeast Texas, is the most populous county in the state. So we are, as a nation, having a very different security story depending on what state you happen to live in. Well, I will note that we are in much better shape now than we were 4 years ago. These paperless electronic machines, for the large part, were purchased 10 to 15 years ago, and they're physically wearing out. They're breaking, and election officials are, for the most part, but not universally, replacing them with machines that are better. Charles Stewart talked a little bit about ballot transmission. I want to spend a little bit more time on this. This is a diagram that, again, happens to be from the eSlate system architecture, but they all have something vaguely like this. And they all have either modems or cellular adapters of some kind that allow, quote, unofficial results to be transmitted to some kind of central tabulator. And what that path does is it creates an opportunity for the attacker. This was part of what we studied in 2007 as part of the California top to bottom review. And in fact, there were significant security vulnerabilities in this path. So I should say that we knew about this in 2007. Texas only banned this in 18 or 19. So this particular path is not in use today, as far as I know, in Texas. Other states might still be in use. Vote tabulation and reporting. This was exactly where Stewart's discussion was. So what I'll say is that when you have these centralized machines, you have to worry about tampering or corruption of those either the scanning machine or the computers behind it. But we have a technology to mitigate this called risk limiting audits, but not everybody does them. What is a risk limiting audit? It's a randomized sample of paper ballots where you compare your sampled ballots to the electronic copies of those ballots, and they had better match up. And what you're trying to prove statistically is that you have the correct outcome of the election within a certain confidence interval. And the math goes very deep, but what I want to emphasize is that you need to touch tens or hundreds of ballots, but never more than that, unless the election is so close that it would be an automatic recount anyway. Most states have some notion that when an election is closer than a certain interval, it's an automatic recount. A risk limiting audit is an efficient process that you can do before that to try to figure out whether everything makes sense or not. This process of rolling dice and sampling ballots mitigates against risks in the ballot scanners and tabulation environment. And mitigating risk is an important thing that every election official talks about. They will never claim that their elections are secure. They will claim that the biggest risks are mitigated. So, what happened in 2018? Well, the biggest change in 2018 was the US military got involved in trying to mess with the Russians. I'm going to quote Senator Mike Rounds here. The fact that the 2018 election process moved forward without successful Russian intervention was not a coincidence. Wow. We don't have any technical details. We have hints and nudges. But the best way to understand this is, for Game of Thrones fans, this is operating beyond the wall. This is going outside of the US and trying to mess with the people who are trying to mess with us. It's not foolproof, it's not guaranteed, but it's definitely a new part of the game. And for anybody who's used to cybersecurity in a corporate environment, when the military does it, it's different, because the military can do things that private people can't do. I can't just go hack somebody just because they hacked me. Hacking back is very risk prone. But when we're talking about the military doing it, weighing those risks and having a legal framework to go ahead, that's what the military, to some extent, is all about. So what's the military doing this time? Here's a tweet from earlier this week. And this is a tweet from General Nakasone, who's in charge of Cybercom and NSA. And it says, we're doing things. What? We don't know. All I can really, I watched the video that was attached to this tweet, and the only conclusion, the only useful quote I pull from it is from our FBI director saying, we're not going to tolerate foreign interference in our elections. Great. That's good to hear. But we still need to have a plan if interference does happen. Of course, the big new thing this year is vote by mail, which is an appropriate response to the risks of voters worried about getting COVID-19. But it also creates new challenges for voters who aren't used to the process. Confusing procedures, like some states have these double envelopes for privacy. Written signatures might not match up, particularly if the signature on record is old. Drop boxes, the latest in the state of Texas is that every county is only allowed to have one of them for no rational reason. But that means that's a rule that our governor is enforcing on us. And of course, we have degraded service of the US Postal Service. One thing that's very clear about this is it will take longer for tabulation to happen, particularly in states that aren't even allowed to start tabulation until the election is over. All right. Since part of what my research is about is trying to merge the worlds of cryptography and voting for better security, I'm going to mention that Microsoft is behind a big push to do this in a really great way. The project is called Election Guard. A lot of my own code is inside of this. And what can we do when we merge the worlds of crypto and voting? Well, again, I have a very limited amount of time today, but what I'll say is that we can improve the transparency of results and we can verify the integrity of the tally, but we still must have paper ballots for security. Absolutely nobody who works in this space says, we have cryptography, we have the internet, let's do online voting. That is absolutely not a thing that this enables. Okay, last point, and then I'm going to call it a day. You found an attack. Now what? So it's important to have plans in advance. The best example of this was Hurricane Sandy, which hit the northeastern seaboard in October of 2012. And in this case, we saw Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey flip on a dime from being a strong partisan to closely collaborating with then President Obama. And here's a quote from Christie saying, everything I needed from Obama, he did to help. That was kind of important. Whether disasters are natural or man-made, we still have to plan for them. Like, what do we do if there's an attack on ballot marking devices? Well, we don't want to rerun the election. Well, are we going to have emergency paper ballots? How's that going to work? So it's important that every state and every county have all these procedures worked out in advance. So, summing things up, foreign nation-state adversaries are a very real threat to our elections. And I haven't even scratched the surface of misinformation and social media. That could be another half an hour to an hour of just describing everything going on in that space. But to me, one of our biggest risks is simply what are called denial of service attacks. Tabulation and reporting systems are computers, probably hackable. The only improvement about this relative to the old paperless electronic voting systems is most likely, if we're under attack, we'll know it. And that gives us the opportunity to have mitigation plans that we can hopefully have agreed to in advance and then put in place. All right, I'm gonna cut it there, and I guess I see some questions have popped up. I don't know if we're taking questions now or later, so I'm gonna defer to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Professor Wallach. We're going to hear next from Elizabeth Howard, who serves as Senior Counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where her work focuses on election security.
Thank you, Kenan. Yes, thank you so much. Now I can go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Kenan, is this up for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to the University of Dayton Law School. It is a pleasure to be here on this panel. I think I'm going to try to zoom out a little bit from the comments that you've heard and maybe zoom in a little bit more. So first off, to give kind of an overview about election security in general, which will include cybersecurity. But big picture, it's going to be about protecting all of the systems, all of the people, all of the stakeholders, and all of the infrastructure that's involved in conducting a free and fair election. Unfortunately, there are a lot of issues that election officials have to consider this year that are much more public than they have been in prior years, including physical security, not only for themselves, many of which have reported death threats, but also for their poll workers and others on election day, as we close in on this last leg, 26 or so days before the election. And as you've heard from Charles and Dan, there are a lot of different pieces of this. So the mis and disinformation piece I'm not going to get into, and also the physical security piece I'm not going to get into. But if we talk about infrastructure security and technology security, I think of this kind of in three big buckets, and it's all going to go back to what you've heard from Charles and Dan earlier today, right? We want to implement and adopt measures that are going to prevent successful attacks against our technology and against our infrastructure. We want to implement measures that are going to detect when bad actors are trying to gain unauthorized access and or do harm to our systems. And we want to implement systems that will enable us to recover in the event of a successful attack. And in this framework, we want to talk about election officials being able to recover in a manner that is going to have minimal interruption to the voting process. And again, as you've heard today, there's not a system that's going to be 100% secure. Our goal here from an election security standpoint is to have a resilient system. And most of that is about risk mitigation and accepting some risk and then implementing measures and procedures that are easily deployable in the event, as Dan said, of a disaster, because it will happen somewhere. And certainly for election day, where we have a huge fleet of equipment that is going to be deployed, there will be at least intermittent technological failures across the country. And talking about specifically the electronic poll books that you've heard talked about today, some of the measures, for instance, which are just kind of common sense, would be to have a paper backup copy of the list of registered voters for that precinct. So in the event that there is a successful attack against your electronic poll books, right, and against the information in them, the poll workers have information that they need in order to quickly transition over so that they can provide people that are registered to vote and are at the correct polling location with a regular ballot. In Ohio, you do have this provision. So Ohio election officials are prepared for this in the event of a successful attack against the and/or equipment failure of the electronic poll books. They do have a backup copy of their paper of the poll books, right? So when we think about election security, we often think about what is easily measurable. And the three legs of the election security stool that I think of are having paper ballots, having post-election audits, and having solid cybersecurity measures across the board and across all of your systems. So two things that we can easily measure, so we do, has to do with the type of voting equipment that you use and whether or not you conduct a post-election audit. So this is a map of the states which continue to use paperless voting machines. As you've heard, right, like we've made a lot of progress in the past 4 years. So these 8 states are the only states that continue to use paperless voting machines. Dan lives in Texas. It is one of the states where they have a decentralized system. So some of the counties, including Harris, use paperless voting systems. In good news, Pennsylvania, which as many of you know is a very important battleground state, has recently transitioned over to all paper ballots across the state. So there's lots of good news, even though there is a lot of room for progress. Also, some states don't conduct audits prior to certification, which is a concern. In somewhat good news, most of the states that you see here aren't considered battleground states, and one of the states that you see in red here is Michigan. The company that Dan is with right now, VotingWorks, has done amazing work with the gold standard of post-election audits that he talked about, the risk limiting audit. And so VotingWorks and several other outside organizations are working with Michigan election officials to conduct risk limiting audits. And this, I think the Michigan election officials have been incredible and have voluntarily conducted a statewide risk limiting audit after the presidential primary in the midst of a pandemic. Here in Ohio, you have a very interesting system where election officials basically are required at the local level, at the county level, to conduct post-election audits, but they have a menu of the type of audit that they are going to conduct. So Ohio election officials can choose and either conduct A, a risk limiting audit, or B, what I think of as a traditional post-election audit, which is where precincts are chosen at somehow randomly for up to, I think it's 2 to 5% of ballots. And so election officials will then go back and hand count the ballots cast in those selected precincts and compare those hand counts to the tape. Absolutely having a traditional post-election audit is better than no audit, which is where many of these states are. But again, we think the risk limiting audit is the much better procedure because it is going to provide confirmation of the accuracy of the outcome of the election as opposed to the accuracy of the outcome of a couple selected machines in a couple different precincts. Very, very important and very interesting. And also talking about the machines that you have here in Ohio, you've got multiple different types of machines here. In some counties, in a small number of Ohio counties, you have the types of machines that you saw in Dan's presentation, the DREs, the direct recording electronic machines, which are mostly touchscreens. However, all of the DREs in Ohio have a paper trail. It's often called a VVPAT, or voter verified paper audit trail. So the machine will print out a copy of your selections, and as a voter, you should check this paper copy before you select vote. And if there are any problems or if you see any of the information that's on the paper copy that is not who you intended to vote for, you should let somebody, let a poll worker know immediately. In Ohio, you also have hand-marked paper ballots, which are generally considered the gold standard, and you have kind of a hybrid of the two called a ballot marking device, which is also a touch screen machine where the voter will just tap the screen of his or her computer, and that machine, the ballot marking machine, will print out a ballot. And the details will vary, but many times it will print out a receipt that looks something like what you would get at the grocery store or at the gas station, and it will list the candidates. It will print out the candidates that you have selected. You will take this piece of paper to the tabulator that's at your polling location and insert it there. So it's counted in a very similar way to the hand-marked paper ballots, but there is a machine that's going to select what appears on your ballot. And I think, again, just talking about all the different layers that election officials have in order, to protect the election results and to ensure that there are no errors in the ultimately reported results, I think it's helpful to kind of talk about the cycle of how this works. And, again, going back to Charles's Quisenberry's law, right? Slight variation, every state is a special snowflake, and potentially every local jurisdiction is a special snowflake. And they're all, there are possibilities for variations on any number of these procedures, but just as we get ready for election night and some of the results coming out, I think this is helpful to know. So as a general rule, the election results are going to come from a couple of different places. So first at the polls, and as you've heard, the tabulators at the end of the night will print out a tape that, again, looks very much like what you get at the gas station or at the grocery store. And this tape is going to include the total number of votes cast for each candidate. So Dan got 412, Charles got 758. And election officials will gather that information and they will report it to the local election official. In some places, including in Ohio as a general rule, although I'm sure this might not be consistent across the state, absentee ballots, which we have seen a huge spike of across the country due to the pandemic, are generally counted at the central level. So that means instead of collecting results from the individual precincts and the individual polling locations, these absentee ballots are generally counted at the election official's main office. And so the counting of the absentee ballots is a much different process than getting the results from the polling location. So for the absentee ballots, it is in Ohio, as you know, in order to receive an absentee ballot, a voter has to apply and submit a form to the election official. The election official then decides whether or not to approve or deny that application, and then upon approval of that application, will send the voter a ballot package. So that will require the election official to pull in the correct ballot, multiple different envelopes, and at minimum instructions, and send this ballot out. And in Ohio, you have a ballot tracking system, so there will be a barcode or some other indicia that will allow the voter to track the progress of the ballot in the mail. Then the voter will get the ballot, the voter will return it, and when the election official receives it, again, they're going to check it in so that the voter can be notified that the ballot has been received by the election official. Then on an individual basis, the election officials are going to go through and confirm that the ballot inside is from an eligible voter. So this is going to require, and it varies a little bit state to state, but they might do signature verification, they might do voter authentication. There are a variety of processes that election officials put the absentee ballot returns through before they decide to open the outer envelope. And then you must open the inner envelope. And then a lot of times the election officials will want to flatten out the ballots because they've been folded in the mail, and they're going to want to flatten them because they want to avoid or minimize any sort of paper jams in those big scanners that you saw in Dan's presentation. And so this is going to result in the unofficial election results. And just a reminder, the unofficial election results that you see on election night, again, are unofficial. And in general, they have always been incomplete on election night, or at least for the past several decades, because there are always ballots that need to be adjudicated after election day. These might include provisional ballots, which is where a voter comes in to a polling location and the poll worker cannot find his or her name on the voter list. Provisional ballots could be provided if they have extended the polling hours and or if there is a problem with, for instance, the electronic poll books. So those are adjudicated not on election night, but then in the days following the election. Some states allow ballots to be challenged at the polling location, so those also have to be adjudicated afterwards. And then what we're seeing a lot of now, and this is still subject to change, and it's, there may be a decision in the next couple of days which could impact this, but there will be some number of absentee ballots which were postmarked on or before election day, but which are received after the election. And in some states, ballots received after the election, so long as they are postmarked or there's other indicia that they were sent prior to the election, will be included into the count. And so then there's another procedure that the election officials go through called the canvass, which is generally where election officials gather, and it's generally a rather transparent process, but of course with the pandemic, I think election officials are struggling to figure out the best way to ensure transparency in this process. But the election officials will gather and they will individually go through all of the results that came in from the individual polling locations and do some simple stuff, such as make sure that the math is correct, make sure that there weren't common sense errors, did somebody accidentally add a zero, and go through with fresh eyes, because the poll workers that are completing and reporting up the election results on election night, again, are human, and many of them have been working 15 to 20-hour days. And so mistakes do happen, but that's why we have the canvass, in order to catch those human errors before they are reported on. And then at the local level, generally, you will certify the results, and then the state, you will send that to the state will certify after they have a chance to review and complete their processes. But I think I'm just going to go through, and maybe we can look at this slide, which I think might be of interest, and talking about what I think we're likely to see on election night. Because every state is a special snowflake, the election officials in each different state are subject to different restrictions on when they can start the absentee ballot processing and tabulation process. So what we've seen as we've seen this huge spike in absentee ballots, we've seen multiple states, generally the ones that are traditionally very red or traditionally very blue, respond to their election officials that were begging and asking their legislature to allow them to start processing these absentee ballots before election day and or tabulating them before election day, to give them extra time, because they're aware of the expectation that they provide almost complete election night results. So many legislatures and or other policymakers have responded to that and provided election officials with extra time before election day. In Ohio, I can't remember the exact time date, but I think election officials can start processing absentee ballots maybe 10 days or more prior to election day. So the map that you're going to see on election night is likely to have a couple of different states that have largely incomplete results compared to some other states. And I think it's important to know on the front end that you have election officials in 3 very big, important battleground states that are not on equal footing with their colleagues in other states that can start the counting, at minimum, the processing much earlier. So you can see from this map, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan's in light blue because they got an extra 10 hours, which I don't think is going to provide that much relief to election officials. And actually South Carolina is no longer dark blue. South Carolina, the legislature recently authorized them to start counting a couple of days before the election. So there is at least some potential for these 3 big battleground states to have significantly smaller portions of their election results available on election night than the vast majority of the rest of the country. And I haven't kept up, but I don't think that Wyoming, South Dakota, and Mississippi are going to be considered swing states this election. So I think, our election officials are working very hard to do the best that they can, but setting expectations is absolutely essential. And going back to some of Charles's presentation, which I hope he continues on because it's always always so excited to get to hear from him. You know, part of the red mirage or the blue shift is just a logistics issue. So in Pennsylvania, the results that are in Carbon County, which is say a county of 10,000 people, it is going to be much easier to finish the processing and tabulation of the, you know, couple hundred of absentee ballots that Carbon County may have versus what we're going to see in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has over 1 million registered voters, and they're seeing huge numbers of people requesting absentee ballots. And the reality is, it is just going to take logistically longer, right, to process and tabulate absentee ballots in Philadelphia, which is generally considered a very blue jurisdiction. So that is at least part of, you know, some of what, you know, some of what you've seen as far as the red mirage and the blue shift. But I really look forward to your questions and the rest of this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. I want to give a little bit of time to Professor Stewart. He fit into his time limit, but he had a few more things to say. I want to make sure those thoughts are shared, but I also want to remind folks to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom so we can start taking those as soon as Professor Stewart is done this last few minutes.
Thanks, and in the interest of getting to the questions, which I think will be of great interest and fun, let me just say a couple of things to tie off what I was going to say, and they're consistent with what both Liz and Dan said, so I don't need to really dwell on them. But remember, I ended my talk by talking about election night reporting and the issues that have arisen. And again, in this election, again, Liz was just talking about a lot of them. In my role as the leader of one of the leaders of the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, I've been spending a lot of time over the last several months talking to election officials and also talking to media organizations about their intentions to report on election night. And so I'll just end by noting the things that the election officials have been talking about doing in response to the vulnerabilities of election night reporting systems, both the physical vulnerabilities and the information warfare vulnerabilities, and then also what the media are thinking about doing. Obviously, election officials need to protect their ENR systems and institute kind of resilience plans in the event that they are attacked. One of the things that election officials are very aware of is the fact that the election night reporting is actually the biggest, as they say, threat surface facing facing outward in the world among the various systems that they operate. They're very aware of that. To the point that a number of states are actually toying with the idea of getting out of election night reporting, at least with respect to reporting to the public, and just letting the AP, Edison, and other organizations do the reporting themselves, because the threat is so great to them and they're so worried about it. The other thing I would say about election officials is that there's this issue of transparency that I love election officials, but I think they haven't been quite as good as they might be. And here's a shout out to Liz's old employer. The Virginia Elections Board does a great thing by publishing a change log after election night of all the changes that get made to the election night tally and the reason why those changes have been made, and more states need to do that. In any case, changes on election official side. On the media side, there's a number of changes that are occurring as the media recognize the environment in which they're going to be reporting election results in this election. The idea of reporting precincts, precincts reported is going to go out the door pretty much with every media outlet except for the Associated Press, as will the locution of "we have called the winner." Again, the Associated Press is clinging to that, but the other media outlets are understanding the problem of declaring winners, especially on election night, and how to communicate that. One of the things I should note is that now that we have two media operations that are independently reporting what they're seeing in their election returns to the American people. There's actually a chance now for the mutual reporting to more quickly catch errors as they compare to each other, and both are watching what each other is doing, and as they're communicating back with the states. And it should be noted that the AP and Edison and the states are in communication in the night as they're finding anomalies. So actually, I think that the error correction system that is arising in election night reporting may actually be to the nation's benefit this year. And so with those remarks, I'll always have a lot more to say about this, but I'd be happy to hear what the questions are and engage in a conversation with my friends on the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we have an opportunity to get to your questions. If you have not asked your question yet, please put it in the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom. You can float your mouse over the bottom to get there. We're going to ask our speakers to turn on their video at this time so we can see you. I'm going to ask a very general question. We have some great questions from the audience, but I want to get your general assessment for our listeners and viewers. If there was a problem on election day with cybersecurity, would the average person be able to tell? And if so, how? And I thought we could go in the order that you've spoken just to make it clear. Professor Stewart, if you want to take that one.
Could you tell, I mean, that's maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, I think that's always going to be the right answer here. It depends on the system that's attacked. I mean, one of the things we all worry about and why I think all of us, not to speak for all of us, but I will, I mean, one of the reasons why we're all advocates of risk limiting audits and other audits is that why assume everything is going to go well? Why not prove it after election day? And so, so yeah, I'll say that, which is a quasi punt, but I think it's true.
Professor Wallach, you want to weigh in?
I would say that I mentioned that there's really two kinds of attacks we have to worry about. There are attacks that are like denial of service attacks, where we'll know because everything stopped working. Voters' lines are backing up, people are getting angry. We will know if that kind of attack is happening. And that's something where election officials have to plan in advance. The more subtle attacks, where votes are missing from electronic records, that's the kind of thing that might happen quietly. And that's why, if those things happen, that's why we like to have paper ballots, because then we have backups. So it's really all about mitigation. How do we mitigate against our voter rolls disappearing because they were hacked? Well, if we have to do provisional voting for everybody, the lines will be miserable. So maybe we can have paper poll books, but for places where any voter can go to any polling location, that doesn't really work so well, and it becomes much harder to mitigate. All I can say is I really hope we don't face the worst of the denial of service attacks, because they're the hardest to defend against.
Yeah, this is Liz. I mean, I'll just say in good news that the appropriate backup measures to protect and minimize the impact on voting are going to be the same, whether or not it's a cyber attack or a technical failure. And so just like Dan talked about, right, like, election officials should have paper poll book backups in the event of any problem, whether it's a technical glitch or a successful cyber attack on the electronic poll books. Election officials need to have emergency paper ballots in the event that there is any sort of problem with the voting machines. Ohio, we think they could do better, but as a general rule, Ohio has at least the minimum provisional ballot materials that election officials are required to have at each polling location, and emergency paper ballots. So kind of on the spectrum, I think, Ohio is at the better prepared end, although there's more room, there's some room for improvement.
Great, okay. Could panelists speak to governance of elections operations? Is it exclusively by the states? How are these efforts in technology predominantly funded? The local, state, national taxes, are those the major sources? And I don't know, Liz, if you want to take this one to start.
So, I mean, I will just say as a general rule, our election infrastructure and election officials have been chronically underfunded for years and years. We saw Congress kind of acknowledge that now that we are under attack from foreign adversaries, that they would provide some funding for election officials and have provided about $800 million. And earlier this year, they provided $400 million to help election officials pay for the additional costs associated with administering an election in a pandemic. Let me be very clear here. This is not even close to enough money for our election officials to catch up and buy the technology that they need and ensure that they have the staff and the infrastructure that they want to do. I mean, as a general rule, we have found that election officials, want to have the best, most secure, most resilient system out there. The main impediment is financial resources.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, I think when the story is written of this election, one of the saddest, in some ways kind of, high-minded moments, but also saddest moments will be this, that probably $500 million in private philanthropy has flowed to state and local governments to run this election. The federal government and all of its resources appropriated $300 million. And so this is basically bake sale for democracy for this election. So, we'll get through this because of, volunteerism, but that's no way to run a railroad.
Yeah. Somebody asked, my understanding is that the Democratic Party politicians in Congress supported legislation to mitigate the vulnerabilities in our election system. What was in this legislation and why was it blocked exactly?
Well, certainly very interested to hear from Charles and Dan on this, but there are a couple, no one will be surprised that there are a couple different bills that really didn't go anywhere. Kind of the two big ones that we worked on were the Secure Elections Act, which ended up being co-sponsored by Republicans. And of course, any election security legislation that's going to make it has to have Republican support because the Democrats control the House and the Republicans control the Senate. And Mr. Trump is in the White House. So we thought that we had some good traction with the Secure Elections Act, which again was modest in its final form, which would have provided funding for risk limiting audits. It would have required, again, which sounds modest, but really would be a big improvement, mandatory cyber incident reporting by election vendors, and would have provided additional funding for states that needed to transition over to paper ballots. Part of the reason that didn't go anywhere, according to Senator Blunt, who is the chair of the Senate Rules Committee, is that Leader McConnell had some anxiety about the potential for this bill to be considered a federal takeover of our elections. And Republicans are always have a concern about any federal legislation kind of overtaking the state's role. And certainly in the election space, that those concerns are always at top of mind for the Republicans.
That's right.
For states that are counting their ballots before Election Day, are there likely to be challenges or litigation regarding ballots before the official election day, November 3rd?
I'll start. Yes. Actually, one of the things I should say, a slight amendment to what Liz was talking about in terms of her map, which was great, and that was a great talk. But I think, there's another dimension that when I talk to folks, there's another dimension that needs to be laid on top of this. When can you start counting, et cetera, and that is kind of the political culture, the political structure of this challenge process. And so, for instance, the reason why I'm really worried about Pennsylvania is that it's partisanship, it's turtles all the way down, as they say. It's partisanship at every level. And there is, when I've talked to folks in Pennsylvania, I've been told there is a practice and a history of frivolous challenges to paper ballots. So, although they're not going to start ahead of time, and that was the question, I would argue that the problem in Pennsylvania is how easy it is to challenge a ballot and how long it takes to resolve that challenge in that state. And so certainly every state that's going to be counting early on is going to have a process by which The parties and the campaigns can challenge individuals, when those ballots come in. But there are some states that have very high bars for that challenge, where you, for instance, have to have a reason, an identifiable reason for every single ballot with evidence that you should challenge it. And the courts have historically upheld that. I understand, like Wisconsin is an example of a state like that. Down to other places where it's just common. New York is, I've also understand, a state that's like this, where the practice has been the parties just to go and just try to, can very easily just deny ballots. But that can happen before the count, the election day, or after the election day. And the citizens should be aware of that. I think Ohio's okay with respect to what the standards are, but some of these other states, it's really quite easy to challenge, and it's going to be a mess potentially.
I think just from a voter perspective, if I can weigh in and say that if that happens to you, I don't think it's going to happen to most of the people listening, but if you are challenged, just stay put and show your ID and prove you are who you are, and you will be fine and you will be able to vote. So don't let that intimidate you in any way. It's just what's being discussed right now, and you should be aware of it.
I think it's also worth mentioning that there have been a number of lawsuits around process and procedures. I mean, just in Texas, we've had lawsuits about, can county clerks send out absentee ballot applications? Not even the ballots, the applications for ballots. Straight ticket voting was recently banned by the legislature, and this, I believe, might be the first election that new rule is in place. There was a lawsuit that I wrote a declaration for to try to undo that, so that way the straight ticket voting would be back on the ballot. And I believe a judge ruled in favor of that, and we'll see if it actually sticks. I can't wait to find out what my ballot looks like next week. There are lawsuits going on as we speak about ballot drop boxes for vote by mail. Presently, the governor is requiring counties can only have one. And Harris County, population 4-point-something million, really could stand to have more than one drop box. So each of these procedural aspects of the election are also being litigated. And that's just Texas. Each of the states is its own world.
And I would just add on, and my apologies if I was not clear earlier, even though, well, two things, right? Like there's two separate processes here, processing absentee ballots and tabulating them.
Yeah.
Some states will tabulate prior to election day their absentee ballots, such as Florida, right? However, no state, I mean, unless Charles Dan, tell me if I'm wrong, no state provides any information about the results prior to after the polls close on election night. So I think that's an important thing to remember for this piece of the conversation.
Yeah. All right, we have a question that you've all answered before. I think you could give a one-word answer. We'll see. Is it possible to have secure online voting? Would blockchain tech allow for secure online voting?
1, 2, 3. No.
You want to elaborate, Professor Stewart or Professor Wallach? You haven't had much.
So the long and the short of it is that blockchain technologies are incredibly useful at protecting the integrity of data to make sure that what you put in earlier and what you got out later are the same. It doesn't solve the problem that there might be malware on your computer that tampers with your vote. It doesn't solve the problem that, it doesn't solve the problem that malware might be on your computer that just tries to record how you vote in order to enable bribery or coercion of the voter. It doesn't solve the problem that not everybody has a computer. So you're worried about introducing partisan impacts depending on who has an appropriate computer that has the security features that you demand for your online voting system. So the long and the short of it is we are a long time. It's possibly a decade away before we will have the kind of security technology base to be able to contemplate online voting. With today's technology, we simply can't do it.
Thanks. Election security was all over the news 2016, 2017, 2018. This year, obviously, there was a pandemic. There's wildfires, not flowers. Sorry, not being way better. I wish there was just tons of wildflowers, but no fires, derechos, there's a hurricane hitting the coast. There's a lot going on. There's not a lot of news about cybersecurity in our elections lately. Are you concerned about that in terms of awareness and response?
I mean, certainly we're concerned about it. I think I speak for everybody. We all hope that cybersecurity isn't the defining feature of this election. And at least so far, you know, like the social networks like Facebook and Twitter are really aggressively working to crack down on misinformation. We could argue about whether they're doing enough, but they're doing a lot more than they were 4 years ago. And election officials, are they perfect? No, but they're doing a lot more than they did 4 years ago. So in many respects, we are on a much better footing to defend against cyber problems now than we were 4 years ago. And all I can say is I hope it's enough.
Yeah, if I could just add, just underscore what Dan said then in his presentation. I think one of the things, you know, because of all the noise in Washington around whether there was Russian interference or not, much of the public is unaware about what the federal government is doing and the thousands of people in the federal government that are working on this problem, and the degree of cooperation with state and local officials on the issue, and the work that, as Dan said, state and local officials have done. My sense is that state and local officials recognize, most of them, that they are not invincible. So they've done what they can and what they believe they should do to harden systems, et cetera. But they've also learned the word resilience, and you hear this word all the time. What are we going to do when we get attacked? Because we will be attacked. And even if we aren't attacked, there will be mistakes will be made, and we will be prepared for those. And so with respect to these sorts of things, you know, knock on wood, you know, we hope, but it is a real different world than it was 4 years ago. But now we have COVID, and now we have, you know, we have an asteroid coming our way on election day. I'm waiting for the zombies.
Don't say that. Well, Professor Wallach brought up disinformation in Facebook. One of the questions we got from one of our viewers, can anyone speak to the mis and disinformation threats using technology and how that can impact the election results reporting?
Well, okay. So I hate to start. I'll start this time. I won't start the next one. I mean, I think, look, this is, so there's a couple of things that folks in this space are most directly worried about. So why don't we talk about a few of those things? And I think the thing that most people in this space, regardless of partisanship, are worried about is what happens when basically we get something like this blue shift, this red mirage dynamic on election night. And not only does tweeting start from, you know, social media, you know, the president starts complaining, you know, the campaigns start complaining, but then also all of the domestic and foreign influencers start yapping on social media about what's going on. Because one of the things we do know is that at some point on election night, for instance, if you're watching the election returns in Florida, Biden will be way ahead. And at some point, Biden will be way behind. And someone's going to notice that. And that's going to, and, you know, someone is going to try to take advantage of that for propaganda purposes, for strategic purposes. And so I think we just have to, you know, we have to be ready to understand that, and this is why I think all of us, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but why we're really trying to educate the public and the media about these dynamics, because we have to be ready for uncertainty, volatility, and information early in the night and over a few days, and to be ready for strategic actors, whether they be the campaigns, whether they be foreign actors, whether they be just media outlets that love a fight and are trying to get eyeballs. We need to understand what's likely to be happening and to be informed consumers. The danger of all of that, by the way, is being nihilistic about it and believing that we can know nothing on election night. And so that's why I think that we need to be informed consumers rather than just say we can know nothing on election night and we should just go pack away for 2 weeks and come back and see how the elections were. Because that's not going to be helpful either. So yeah, there's going to be confusion, and when there's confusion, people who strategically who want to take advantage of it are already planning on taking advantage of it.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, from this perspective, you know, going back, I would put potential attacks on our infrastructure in one bucket. So trying to hack technology or voting equipment, and in a different bucket, I would put trying to hack people, right? By spreading mis and disinformation and sowing discord and undermining voter confidence in our election administration and our democracy. And so, you know, there could be technological issues on election night with election night reporting. And what I certainly expect to see on election night is a lot of mis and disinformation. And just going back to what Charles said, like a big piece of this, and it even goes back to what DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is putting out for voters, right? The 3 Ps. The first of which is to plan and be prepared. And that is, you know, a flag so that everyone, right, knows what the procedures are in their jurisdiction, in their state, so they can pick the best option for them to vote. Then the second P is participate, and the third P is to be patient. And election officials have the procedures in place to make sure that the accurate election results are reported. But, you know, we might need to be patient on election night. Again, as there are likely to be multiple important states that might determine the outcome of this election that will not have enough of the results reported out for the press to make predictions. And we've already seen the president indicate that, you know, all of our election results have to be finished on election night, which has never been true historically and is not going to be true Tuesday, November 3rd.
Yeah, if I could just chime on this one, disinformation and misinformation is something that everybody can help with. And you just keep in mind that people that you see on your social media who are starting fights, who are trying to divide people, even if you agree with them, their goal is to start fights and push moderate voices and compromisers who make democracy work by working out how we're going to govern ourselves out of the process and make it divided so that we fight each other. That's certainly what Russian actors have been documented trying to do. So be really careful about what you share and where you pour fuel on the fire. If someone disagrees with you and they're trying to get you to react, not reacting may be the best thing you can do, and rather finding your local election official who's a trusted voice by most people and reposting what they're sharing with basic voting information, or posting basic voting information from other good government groups that are just trying to be nonpartisan and get people involved in the process. That is a much better way to go than engaging in those fights and increasing the division or furthering misinformation, even if it favors your particular political view. And you can also report disinformation. There's a number of different services to do this, but I'll give you one. commoncause.org/disinformation is one. Squint is another. That's like a little app you can use. I find it a little bit hard to use. Anyway, just be cognizant, because everybody has a role to play in the misinformation, disinformation space, and you want to be a positive actor spreading factual information from trusted voices like election officials at your state and local level. So we have just a little bit of time left, and I want to make sure that I have 2 questions and then we'll wrap. There's what you think election officials still can do between now and the election to secure it, and things like Cloudflare can stop denial of service attacks that Dan Wallach was raising. And also, why do some states still have paperless voting systems? Is it just a cost issue?
Yes, I can speak to both of these things. Companies like Cloudflare build services that you put around a website, so that way if a whole lot of people visit your website all at once, then Cloudflare can serve up most of the website without having to bug your computer. That works really well for some things, but when it's check if I'm in the voter registration database, Cloudflare doesn't have that. It has to go back to the county or state website, which has the database, and that's what we just saw get overloaded a couple days ago in Florida. So you can't just like wave a magic wand and make the scalability problem go away. Engineering scalable websites is hard, and it's a traditional problem that it's at least a well understood problem. You can buy books about it. You can take classes on how to do it, but it's one more thing we have to do to get right. When we're talking about how come we have such ancient voting technology in use, it's all about the money. Where did we get all the current voting machines? Largely a result of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, where Congress allocated several $billions to replace the then antiquated lever machines and punch cards. And so we bought brand new gear in the early to mid 2000s, and there hasn't been an infusion of cash since then. So now we're back to antiquated old machines again. They're just newer antiquated machines. And I don't know if Congress has the appetite to have a Help America Vote Act 2. The current Congress is certainly not going to do it. The next Congress, who knows?
Professor Stewart, do you want to chime in with the answers to the questions and any closing thoughts?
Yes, very quickly on those questions. And then first of all, the first question was, what can election officials do? And actually, you know, I've been writing a non-ending stream of op-eds in this area for the last 6 months. And a month ago, my colleague and I, we've been writing together, we pretty much decided to stop giving advice to election officials, in part because it's too late. The election's here, and they've done what they've done. And so God bless you guys. We're rooting for you. So anyway, I mean, the election is here, and they'll learn. The one thing I'd add for today, which is not quite a disagreement, but a little bit of an amendment, is that the other reason why we still have kind of paperless systems is that there is a status quo bias in election systems in the United States, and we see this, and we saw this around HAVA. You know, the places overwhelmingly that got the DREs had mechanical lever machines. And you know, the places that had paper largely, not entirely, largely went to scanned paper. So if there ever is new money, and there will have to come new money, because as Dan says, some of this equipment is just falling apart. There also still needs to be kind of education and working on some local governments that have DREs, for instance, to convince voters in those places. Keep in mind, voters in places that have DREs, I've done a lot of research in this, they love the DREs. They distrust paper. So when the money does become available, or when the DREs do finally crumble into dust, there still will need to be political and other work in many of these jurisdictions to help the voters and the decision makers understand the value of paper. Because it's not going to be an easy sell in many places. So my final thought is, I'm delighted that people in Ohio and in Dayton are interested in these issues and vote.
Yeah, this is Liz. You know, I think there are just a couple of things that, even as a former election official who perhaps didn't appreciate it so much when others were telling me what to do from the outside, I'm happy to give that advice now. You know, they could perhaps purchase more emergency paper ballots and/or purchase more provisional ballot materials that they could distribute to the polls. I think that's, you know, but as Charles and Dan are mentioning, right, the reality is that the menu of options of things that the election officials can do gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we get to election day. But I think in my closing thoughts, you know, in general, the election in 2020 is going to be the most secure election that we've ever had in this country. And our election officials are working day and night to provide voters with safe and secure options. And I think that if anyone here, right, has any questions about their system and what their options are, all of us would be happy to help. And it is, again, like Charles said, I'm so excited that people are interested in this topic. That's awareness is such a big part of making change. And so thanks so much to everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Stewart, Professor Wallach, Ms. Howard. It's been a pleasure. Thank you also to the University of Dayton School of Law and the University of Dayton Human Rights Center for hosting this panel. I want to invite all of our participants to register for the next session of the Elections 2020 series on campaign finance and other First Amendment issues. The speakers, again, just incredible experts from all over the country. Please take advantage of this. Chiara Torres Belcisi, the professor of law at Stetson University, Ann Southworth, who's a professor of law at UC Irvine School of Law, Craig Holman, who's a colleague of mine, a public citizen in government affairs. Do take advantage of these incredible experts made available to you. And thank you again to the University of Dayton.
Megan?
Hi, I was just asked to unmute, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk a little bit about an opportunity that's available to some UD students. This is through the University of Dayton Campus Ministry. I'm a campus minister here at UD, and my name is Megan Crowley. I forgot to introduce myself. And this is an opportunity for UD students to do some reflection on your values and how you want to use your voice and your vote faithfully. This is called Vox, Using Your Voice and Your Vote Faithfully. And it's a digital retreat that's free and available to all UD students. All you have to do is register on our website. And like I said, this encourages folks to discern your own values, your faith, and how your faith tradition might ask you to be engaged civically. So it's set up in 5 modules, and you work through them completely on your own. And you don't have to turn anything in. It's totally free. And yeah, that's pretty much it. You can access our digital retreat Vox on our website or through this tiny URL that I've put in the chat box. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Once again, my name is Megan Crowley, and this digital retreat around voting is called Vox. So I hope you find it useful.
Thank you so much. Hope students take advantage of that opportunity and everyone to engage civically in the best path for you. Thanks again.